Have you ever noticed how some families just seem to have money, generation after generation, while other families work just as hard but never seem to get ahead? Here's what nobody talks about. It's not about luck, it's not about inheritance, and it's definitely not about working harder. The families that build generational wealth do something completely different. Something so quiet, so invisible, that most people never even notice it happening. Here at Simple Money, we've spent years studying what actually separates families that build lasting wealth from families that stay trapped in the cycle. And today, I'm going to reveal the quiet habits that secretly build generational wealth. The habits that happen behind closed doors. The habits that nobody talks about at dinner parties. Because here's the thing. Generational wealth isn't built in a single lifetime with one brilliant investment or one big break. It's built through specific behaviors repeated consistently over decades. Behaviors that seem almost boring when you first hear about them. But boring builds wealth. And today, you're going to learn exactly how. Here's what's really happening with generational wealth, and why most people completely misunderstand it. When you see a wealthy family, you see the results. The nice house, the good schools, the financial security. Maybe you assume they inherited it. Maybe you think they got lucky. Maybe you figure they're just smarter with money. But you're seeing the tip of the iceberg. The 90% underwater? That's decades of quiet habits nobody saw. Think about it this way. A tree doesn't grow in a day. You plant a seed. You water it consistently. You protect it from storms. You give it time. Years pass. Then one day, people notice you have this massive, beautiful tree, and they think you're lucky. They didn't see the watering. They didn't see the protecting. They didn't see the waiting. They just see the tree. Generational wealth works the same way. The families that build it are doing things right now that won't pay off for decades. They're making decisions that look completely ordinary in the moment, but compound into something extraordinary over time. And here's where it gets interesting. These habits aren't secret because wealthy families are hiding them. They're secret because they're so unglamorous that nobody pays attention. There's no viral moment, no dramatic transformation, no exciting story to tell. Just consistent, quiet behaviors that slowly, inevitably, build wealth that lasts for generations. The problem is, our culture celebrates the opposite. We celebrate the big win, the dramatic success story, the overnight millionaire, the viral business idea. But that's not how generational wealth works. That's how you make money once. Generational wealth is about creating a system that makes money forever. And the habits that create that system? They're hiding in plain sight. The first habit that builds generational wealth is what I call the conversation shift. And this one is absolutely foundational to everything else. Here's what I mean. In families that build generational wealth, they talk about money differently. Not occasionally. Not when there's a crisis. Constantly. Naturally. Like it's the most normal thing in the world. They talk about it at dinner. They include kids in financial decisions. They explain why they're making certain choices. They share their thinking about investments. They discuss opportunities and risks openly. Money isn't a taboo topic. It's not shameful. It's not stressful. It's just information that gets shared like any other information. Now, contrast that with most families. In most families, money is either never discussed or only discussed during fights. Kids grow up having no idea how money actually works. They don't know what their parents earn. They don't understand bills or investments or decisions. Then they turn 18 and they're supposed to magically know how to handle money. It's like never teaching someone to swim and then throwing them in the ocean. Here's why this matters so much. Financial literacy isn't taught in schools. It's taught at home. Through observation, through conversation, through modeling. Kids in wealthy families absorb financial thinking from a young age. Not through formal lessons, through casual exposure. They hear their parents discussing whether to pay off the mortgage early or invest the extra money. They learn that there are trade-offs, that decisions have consequences. That money is a tool to be managed, not a mystery to be feared. By the time they're adults, they have thousands of hours of financial education that kids from other families never received. They have mental models. They have frameworks. They have comfort with financial concepts. That's a massive advantage that's completely invisible from the outside. I've seen this play out over and over. I know someone who started including their 10-year-old daughter in simple financial discussions. Not complicated investment talk, just basics. Why they chose to save for a family vacation instead of buying it on credit. Why they invested in index funds. What compound interest means. That kid is now 16. She already understands more about money than most adults. She's already making smart financial decisions. She's already thinking long-term. Not because she's brilliant, because she's been absorbing financial thinking since she was 10. That's the conversation shift. Making money a normal, regular, educational topic of conversation. The second habit is what I call the asset accumulation obsession. And this might be the most important wealth-building behavior there is. Here's the core insight. Families that build generational wealth are absolutely obsessed with accumulating assets. Not stuff, assets. Things that produce income or appreciate in value. Every financial decision gets filtered through one question. Does this help us accumulate more assets? They get a bonus? It goes into assets. They get a raise? The extra money goes into assets. They sell something? The proceeds go into assets. They're not depriving themselves. They're not living like monks. They're just ruthlessly consistent about prioritizing asset accumulation over consumption. This is completely different from how most people operate. Most people earn money and then decide what to buy with it. Car, vacation, new phone. The default is spending. Wealthy families flip the script. The default is investing. Spending is what you do after you've hit your investment goals for the month or year. Let me give you a specific example of how powerful this is. I watched two families over a 15-year period. Both started with similar incomes, around $100,000 per year. Family A lived a nice lifestyle. They upgraded their house as they could afford it. They took good vacations. They bought reasonable cars. They saved a little for retirement. Normal middle-class choices. Family B lived more modestly. Smaller house. Cheaper cars. Budget vacations. But every dollar they didn't spend on lifestyle went into buying rental properties and index funds. 15 years later, Family A had a net worth of maybe $300,000, most of that in home equity and retirement accounts. They were on track for a comfortable retirement. Family B had a net worth of $1.2 million, multiple rental properties generating passive income, investment accounts that had compounded significantly. They'd created a wealth engine. The difference wasn't income. It was the asset accumulation obsession. Family B made it their mission to own things that produced wealth. Family A focused on consuming things that provided comfort. Here's what makes this habit so powerful for generational wealth. Assets compound. The more you have, the faster they grow. The faster they grow, the more you can acquire. It's a virtuous cycle that accelerates over time. And once you build enough assets, they start producing income on their own. That income can buy more assets. Those assets produce more income. Suddenly, you're building wealth without even working for it. That's how generational wealth happens. You build the machine once, then it runs forever. The third habit is what I call the education investment mentality. And this one might surprise you because it's not about college. Here's what families that build generational wealth understand. The best investment they can make is in developing skills and knowledge that produce income over a lifetime. They invest heavily in education, but not just formal education. They invest in experiences that build competence, skills training, mentorships, internships, travel that expands perspective, books, courses, coaching. They're not trying to check boxes or get credentials. They're trying to develop capabilities that generate earning power. This shows up in how they think about their kids' development. They're not just pushing for good grades. They're cultivating curiosity, work ethic, critical thinking, social skills, financial literacy. They expose their kids to different industries and career paths. They help them build networks. They teach them to identify opportunities. They model entrepreneurial thinking. The goal isn't to create doctors or lawyers. The goal is to create competent, capable people who can generate wealth in any economy. Here's why this matters for generational wealth. If you just give your kids money, they might blow it. That happens all the time. Wealthy families lose fortunes in a single generation because the kids didn't develop the skills to manage or create wealth. But if you develop their capabilities, they can always create wealth. Even if they lose everything, they have the mental models and skills to build it back. That's the real inheritance, not the money. The mindset and capabilities that generated the money in the first place. I know a family that spent $30,000 sending their teenage son to work on a ranch in Montana for a summer. Not a vacation. Work. Hard, physical labor, problem solving, responsibility. That seemed crazy to their friends. $30,000 for manual labor? But here's what happened. That kid learned more about work ethic, resilience, and real-world problem-solving in 3 months than he'd learned in years of school. He came back different, more mature, more capable, more confident. That $30,000 investment shaped how he approached every challenge after that. He went on to build a successful business because he understood hard work and wasn't afraid of challenges. That's the education investment mentality. Investing in capabilities, not just credentials. The fourth habit is what I call the leverage obsession, and this is where wealthy families really separate themselves from everyone else. Here's what I mean by leverage: using resources, systems, or other people's time to multiply your own efforts. Wealthy families are constantly looking for ways to create leverage. They don't just work hard. They work to build systems that work for them. They hire people. They create businesses. They invest in things that multiply their time and money. This is completely different from the middle-class mentality of trading time for money. Middle-class families think about earning through labor. Wealthy families think about earning through leverage. Let me break this down with a specific example. A middle-class person works 40 hours per week and earns a salary. To earn more, they need to work more hours or get a raise. Their earnings are linear. More time equals more money. A wealthy family thinks differently. They might work 40 hours per week too, but they're building something that multiplies their effort. A business with employees, an investment portfolio, real estate with property managers, systems that work while they sleep. Their earnings aren't linear, they're exponential. They create something once and it generates returns forever. This is how you create generational wealth. You build leverage. You create systems. You make your money work for you instead of working for your money. Here's a real example. I know someone who spent 10 years building a small software company. It was hard, long hours, lots of stress. But they weren't just working for a paycheck. They were building an asset. Eventually, that company employed 20 people and generated $3 million in annual revenue. The owner worked maybe 20 hours per week at that point because the team handled operations. That's leverage. They traded 10 years of intense work for a system that now generates wealth with minimal ongoing effort. Compare that to someone who worked just as hard for 10 years in a corporate job. They probably earned a good salary, maybe got promoted, but they're still trading 40 hours for a paycheck. No leverage, no compounding, no system working for them. The leverage obsession is about constantly asking, how can I multiply my efforts? How can I create systems? How can I make money while I sleep? That's how families build wealth that lasts generations. They build leverage machines that their kids can inherit and improve. The fifth habit that builds generational wealth is what I call the long game mindset. And this might be the hardest habit to develop because it requires patience that most people simply don't have. Here's the core principle. Families that build generational wealth optimize for outcomes decades in the future, not outcomes this year. They're planting trees they'll never sit under. They're building wealth their grandkids will benefit from. They're making sacrifices today for returns they might not even see in their lifetime. This shows up in how they make decisions. They buy assets that might not pay off for 20 years. They invest in their kids' education knowing the returns won't show up for decades. They build businesses designed to last generations, not to flip quickly. The long game mindset means being willing to look unsuccessful in the short term to be wildly successful in the long term. Here's why this is so powerful. Most people play a short game. They optimize for this year, this quarter, this month. They want results now. That's not wrong, exactly. It's just limiting. Because the biggest returns come from things that compound over long periods. And compounding requires time. Think about real estate. Buy a rental property and in year 1, you might barely break even after expenses. It might even feel like a hassle. But hold that property for 20 years? You've probably doubled or tripled your investment. Plus, you've collected rent the whole time. Plus, you've had tenants paying down your mortgage. The wealth was built slowly, over decades. But the people who didn't have the patience to wait never captured that wealth. Or think about index fund investing. Boring, slow, unglamorous. But consistently investing in index funds over 30 years turns middle-class incomes into millionaire retirements. The magic is time and consistency. The long game mindset means understanding this and having the discipline to stick with it even when nothing seems to be happening. I watched someone make a decision that perfectly illustrates this. They had $50,000 to invest. They could have put it into something speculative, trying to double it quickly. Instead, they put it into a boring diversified index fund. 10 years later, that $50,000 had grown to about $120,000. Not flashy, not exciting. But that's $60,000 in gains they wouldn't have had if they'd been chasing quick wins. And here's the thing. They didn't just invest that $50,000 and forget about it. They kept adding money every month for 10 years. They played the long game consistently. Now they have over $300,000, all from being patient and consistent with boring investments. That's the long game mindset. Delayed gratification on steroids. Patience as a wealth-building strategy. But here's what nobody wants to admit, and this is where things get uncomfortable. These habits aren't actually that hard to understand. They're not complicated. They don't require genius-level intelligence. Anyone could theoretically adopt them. So why don't they? Why do most families never build generational wealth, even when they have decent incomes? Because these habits require something that's really, really hard to maintain. They require consistently prioritizing your future self over your current self, year after year, decade after decade. That's not a knowledge problem, that's a psychology problem. Think about what these habits actually require. The conversation shift means having potentially uncomfortable talks about money. The asset accumulation obsession means saying no to things you want today. The education investment mentality means spending money on things that won't pay off for years. The leverage obsession means taking risks and doing hard work up front. The long game mindset means delaying gratification indefinitely. Every single one of these habits requires you to deny yourself something today for a benefit tomorrow. And our brains hate that. Our brains are wired for immediate gratification. They're wired to value present rewards way more than future rewards. That's not a character flaw. That's evolution. For most of human history, there was no point planning for decades in the future. You might not survive that long. Better to eat the food today than save it for next year when you might be dead. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world where you can reasonably expect to live 80 years. Where planning for decades ahead makes sense. Where delayed gratification creates compound returns. Your brain hasn't caught up to this reality. It's still wired for immediate gratification. That's why these habits are hard. Wealthy families have developed cultural norms and systems that override these instincts. They've created family identities around these values. They've built structures that make these behaviors automatic. But for most people, it requires constant willpower, constant discipline, constant choosing the future over the present. And that's exhausting. This is why generational wealth is rare. Not because the habits are secret, not because they're complicated, but because they require sustained discipline that most people can't maintain. Let me tell you about two families I've watched closely. I'm going to call them the Martinez family and the Chen family. Both immigrant families. Both started with almost nothing. Both worked incredibly hard. The Martinez family focused on creating a good life today. They worked hard, earned decent money, and enjoyed the fruits of their labor. When they got raises, they upgraded their lifestyle. Better house, nicer cars, good vacations. They valued education and sent their kids to good schools. They were involved parents. They did everything right by conventional standards. Their kids grew up comfortable. They went to college. They got decent jobs. They're doing fine. Middle-class jobs, middle-class lives. Nothing wrong with that, but there was no wealth multiplication happening. Each generation started over financially. The parents worked hard to provide a good life, but they didn't build assets that could compound across generations. 30 years later, the Martinez parents are in their 60s. They have maybe $500,000 saved for retirement. They own their home, they're okay, but they're still dependent on their jobs. One health crisis could derail everything. Their adult kids are starting their own families, and they're starting from scratch financially, just like their parents did. Now let me tell you about the Chen family. They took a completely different approach. They also worked hard and earned decent money, but they lived significantly below their means. Not because they were cheap, because they were obsessed with building assets. They talked about money constantly with their kids. Not in a stressful way. They just made financial thinking part of daily life. They explained their decisions. They taught concepts. They made it normal. Every raise, every bonus, every extra dollar went into assets. First, they saved for a down payment. Then they bought a duplex. They lived in one unit and rented out the other. The rent helped cover the mortgage. They kept saving. A few years later, they bought another rental property, then another. They invested in index funds. They built slowly and consistently. They involved their kids in all of this. The kids helped with property maintenance. They learned about tenants and leases. They understood how rental income worked. They watched their parents build wealth systematically. The kids went to state schools, not expensive private colleges, because the family prioritized building assets over prestigious degrees. But the kids graduated debt-free and already understood how wealth works. 30 years later, the Chen family owns 5 rental properties worth about $2 million total. They have another $800,000 in investment accounts. They're generating over $100,000 per year in passive income from their rentals and investments. They don't need to work anymore, but they still do because they enjoy it. They've completely opted out of the financial stress most people live with. Their adult kids? They're now buying their own rental properties using strategies they learned watching their parents. They're already building wealth in their 20s and 30s. They have a massive head start. The difference between these families wasn't income. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't luck. It was the quiet habits, the consistent behaviors, the long game thinking. The Martinez family optimized for comfort today. The Chen family optimized for wealth tomorrow. Both worked hard. Both were good people. But only one built generational wealth. Here's what most people don't realize about generational wealth, and this is the key insight that changes everything. Generational wealth isn't actually about the money. It's about the operating system. Let me explain what I mean. When you see a wealthy family, you see the money, the assets, the investments, the properties. That's the output. But the real wealth is the operating system that generated those outputs. It's the habits, the mindset, the knowledge, the systems, the way they think about and interact with money. The money itself can disappear. Markets crash. Investments fail. Businesses go bankrupt. If all you inherit is the money, you might lose it. But if you inherit the operating system, you can always regenerate the money. You have the patterns, the thinking, the habits, the knowledge. That's what truly separates families that maintain wealth across generations from families that don't. This is why some families lose everything in the second or third generation while others keep building. The families that lose it inherited money but not the operating system. The families that keep building inherited both. When the Chen kids buy their own rental properties, they're not just copying their parents. They've internalized the operating system. They think like wealth builders. They have the habits. They have the patience. They have the knowledge. Even if they lost everything tomorrow, they'd rebuild because they have the operating system. That's the real inheritance, not the assets. The system that creates assets. And here's the beautiful thing. You can install this operating system starting today. You don't need to be born into it. You don't need wealthy parents. You just need to deliberately adopt these habits and stick with them. The conversation shift. Start talking about money openly and naturally. Make it normal. Teach your kids. Share your thinking. The asset accumulation obsession. Prioritize building assets over consuming. Make investment the default, spending the exception. The education investment mentality. Invest in capabilities, not just credentials. Develop skills that generate income over a lifetime. The leverage obsession. Build systems that multiply your efforts. Create passive income. Make your money work for you. The long game mindset. Optimize for decades, not months. Be patient. Let things compound. These aren't complicated. They're just consistent. Quiet. Unglamorous. The opposite of what social media celebrates. But they work. They work so reliably that you can almost guarantee wealth creation if you stick with them long enough. The families building generational wealth aren't doing anything magical. They're just doing these quiet habits consistently over long periods. That's it. That's the whole secret. It's not exciting. It won't go viral. It won't make a good Instagram story. But it will make your grandkids wealthy. And that's the choice you're really making. Exciting today or wealthy tomorrow. Consumption now or generational wealth later. Playing the short game or playing the long game. The quiet habits that build generational wealth are quiet because nobody notices them happening. There's no dramatic moment, no viral success, just consistent behaviors compounding over decades. But the results? The results are anything but quiet. They're generational security. They're freedom. They're options. They're wealth that outlives you and provides for people you might never meet. You can start building that today. Not with a big dramatic change, just by adopting one quiet habit at a time. Start the conversations. Prioritize assets. Invest in education. Build leverage. Play the long game. Do that consistently for 20 years and you won't recognize your financial position. Do it consistently for 40 years and your kids will have advantages you never had. Do it consistently enough to pass it on and you've created generational wealth. The question isn't whether these habits work. They do. The question is whether you have the patience to let them work. Whether you can stay quiet and consistent while everyone around you is loud and impulsive. The families building generational wealth already know the answer. Now you do too. The only question left is what you're going to do about it.